Hey everybody, I hope you had an amazing 4th of July celebration, an amazing 250th year celebration of our independence, of the Declaration of Independence, of our country that was formed on biblical principles from before the Declaration of Independence was ever written. I'm going to read a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, then I'm going to tell you something that you may not have heard before. And this is a reading from an excerpt within the Founders Bible, which is an amazing Bible, and I highly recommend you getting this Bible. It was put together by David Barton. His son Tim and David Barton are amazing historians and are full of a wealth of knowledge. And they actually have a museum in Texas that has what I know to be more writings, original writings of the Founding Fathers and other historic documents, second only to the Smithsonian Institution. And that's pretty amazing. So, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The summer of 1776 was, in the words of the founder Thomas Paine, one of the times that try men's souls. If you read the timeline of American history from the end of the 7-Year War in 1763 to the Declaration of Independence, you'll see how severely the relationship of the American colonies with Great Britain had deteriorated. In 1764, that just happens to be exactly 200 years before I was born, to help offset its huge war debt and the expenses of running the colonies, the English Parliament imposed the Sugar Act, which increased the duties on imported sugar, textiles, coffee, wines, and dyes. It also reorganized the American customs system to bring stricter enforcement of British trade laws, establishing a court in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that had jurisdiction over all of the colonies in trade matters. Then it passed the Currency Act that prohibited the colonists from issuing any legal tender or paper money, which threatened to destabilize the colonial economy. That was followed in 1765 by the Stamp Act on all printed materials, which was the first colonial tax to be paid directly to England, not their own local legislatures. Next came the Quartering Act that required colonists to house and feed British troops. How would you like to have some stranger come knock on your door and say, all right, you need to put me up for X amount of days and feed me? And, oh, you're not going to get compensated. So while protests and boycotts led to a reversal of the hated Stamp Act, Parliament proceeded to enact the Declaratory Act of 1766, stating they had the power to legislate all laws governing the colonies, which led to outbreaks of violence between British soldiers and colonists. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new colonial taxes on imports such as paper, tea, glass, lead, and paints, and was followed by another groundswell of protests, boycotts, and simmering violence. On March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre occurred as a mob harassed British soldiers, who then fired their muskets point blank into the crowd, killing 5 and injuring 6. To protest the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the British East India Tea Company, or East India Company, a monopoly in trade tea in America, the colonists refused to pay any import duties on the tea on board the British ship Dartmouth. And on December 16th, dumped all the tea into the Boston harbor in what has been called the Boston Tea Party. An angry Parliament retaliated with the first of the coercive or intolerable acts in 1774, placing Massachusetts under military rule and virtually ending any self-rule by the colonists. Many colonists saw this as a direct violation of the British Constitution and a threat to all their liberties. By the time the First Continental Congress met in September 1774, the American colonies had been forced to endure taxation without representation, searches and seizures without probable cause, the confiscation of firearms, and the long list of other legal offenses detailed in the Declaration that Parliament had left unresolved. Yet even when armed conflict in the Revolutionary War broke out on April 19, 1775, with the shot heard around the world on Lexington Green in Massachusetts, few colonists desired complete independence from Great Britain. Most were merely fighting for their rights as subjects of the British Crown, and the Continental Congress was still appealing directly to King George III for help in achieving a reconciliation with Britain. Sentiments changed over the course of the next year, however, as Britain's great military force attempted to crush the rebellion. In August of 1775, the king declared that the American subjects were engaged in open and avowed rebellion. Then, in February 1776, Parliament passed the Prohibitory Act, which established a blockade of American ports and declared American ships to be enemy vessels. The result of all these actions is perhaps best reflected in the words spoken by Thomas Jefferson on November 28, 1775. "Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to a connection on such terms as the British Parliament propose. And in this, I think, I speak the sentiments of America." So, in October 1775, to quell the rebellion, King George III ordered the enlargement of the Royal Army and Navy. When this news reached America in January 1776, it propelled the cause for independence and led many colonists to abandon all hopes of reconciliation. That same month, Thomas Paine published his pamphlet, Common Sense, which in simple, concise terms argued that independence was a natural right and the only possible course for the colonies. In its first few weeks in publication, Common Sense sold more than 150,000 copies and stimulated public debate and support for separation from Great Britain. In May, the Congress learned that the king had negotiated treaties with German states to hire mercenaries to fight in America. His actions convinced many Americans that England was now treating them as foreigners. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation in such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. When the Second Continental Congress, which was essentially the government of the United States from 1775 to 1788, first met in May of 1775, King George III had not replied to the petition for redress of grievances sent by the First Continental Congress. Therefore, the Congress gradually took on the responsibilities of a national government, and one by one began to cut the colony's ties to Britain. In June of 1775, it established a continental currency as well as a continental army, appointing George Washington as its commander-in-chief, and in July created a post office for the United Colonies. The privateering resolution passed in March of 1776 allowed the colonists to arm vessels to patrol and defend against the enemies of these united colonies. On April 6th, 1776, American ports were opened to commerce with other nations, an action that cut the economic ties dictated by Parliament's Navigation Acts. By mid-May 1776, 8 American colonies had decided they would support independence, but Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware resisted. On May 15, 1776, Congress passed a set of resolutions drafted by John Adams that authorized the colonies to set up state governments independent of the crown, and several did. This was an emphatic act of sovereignty, and as such, it necessitated a formal declaration of independence from the crown. 4 of the middle colonies voted against it, and the Maryland delegation walked out in protest. Also, on May 15th, the Virginia Convention passed a resolution that the delegates appointed to represent this colony in General Congress for it to be instructed to propose to that respectable body to declare the United Colonies free and independent states. In keeping with these instructions, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia presented his resolution for independence on June 7th. This was less than a month from July 4th, 250 years ago. Resolved that these united colonies, this is what Richard Henry Lee said, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. There are still some stalwart delegates, however, who wish to pursue the path of reconciliation with Britain, and some threatened to leave Congress if the resolution was passed. On June 10th, Congress voted to postpone discussion of Lee's resolution for 3 weeks of recess. However, before Congress recessed, a committee of 5 was appointed to draft a Declaration of Independence. During those final weeks of June 1776, support for a Congressional Declaration of Independence was consolidated among the colonies. Who were the Committee of 5? And there's a great deal more, and we're going to finish the rest of this next week. But who were the Committee of 5? Can you name the first one? How about John Adams? How about Benjamin Franklin? Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Matter of fact, Roger Sherman signed all of 4 certain documents, and he's the only one. And we'll talk about that next week. So I implore you to get a Founder's Bible. It is amazing. It is filled with amazing truth about our founding fathers and our founding of a biblical nation from day one. I hope you have a blessed day, and we'll talk to you next Sunday when we come back to pick up where we just left off. You take care and have a wonderful day.